There's a moment in life when someone looks at you and realizes they're standing in front of something rare, not loud, not dramatic, just real. And instead of stepping up, they step back. Not because you weren't enough, but because you were too much of the right things. You didn't play the game the way they expected. You didn't beg for attention. You didn't shrink to make them comfortable. And that's when the panic started, because when someone meets a woman who can't be controlled, confused, or easily replaced, it forces them to face something they've been avoiding their entire life. And not everyone is ready for that mirror. You didn't need him, and that shook his identity in ways he didn't know how to name, let alone handle. Because from the very beginning, something about you felt different. Not louder, not colder, just solid. You walked into his life without asking permission to exist there. You didn't arrive carrying expectations for him to save you, fix you, or complete you. You weren't looking for a rescuer. You weren't looking for approval. You were already standing on your own feet when he met you, and that quiet strength unsettled him more than any argument ever could. Most people are raised on an unspoken rule. Love means being needed. It means being essential to someone else's survival, their happiness, their sense of self. So many relationships are built on that invisible contract. I'll give you security if you give me importance. And he was comfortable with that world. He knew how to show up when someone leaned on him. He knew how to be the answer when someone felt lost. That role gave him shape. It gave him purpose. But you didn't come to him empty-handed. You came whole. You had your own life, your own routines, your own sources of meaning. You had friends, passions, scars you'd already learned how to live with. When something went wrong, your first instinct wasn't to collapse into his arms and wait for him to tell you who you were again. You paused, you thought, you handled it. Sometimes you invited him in, not because you couldn't do it alone, but because you wanted to share the moment. And that difference matters more than people realize. Because when someone realizes they are not necessary for your survival, they are forced to confront a deeper question. If I'm not needed, am I chosen? And being chosen is far more vulnerable than being needed. Being needed gives you leverage. Being chosen gives you none. It means the other person stays because they want to, not because they're afraid to be alone. That kind of freedom can feel terrifying to someone who has built their identity around being indispensable. He felt it in small moments. In the way you didn't panic when he took longer to reply. In the way you didn't rearrange your entire life just to fit into his schedule. In the way you could enjoy his presence deeply, but still leave the room with the same sense of self you entered with. You weren't detached. You were present. But you weren't attached in a way that erased you. And that confused him. Because deep down, he was used to being the center of gravity. He was used to being the emotional anchor. When someone didn't orbit around him, when someone didn't slowly give up pieces of themselves to keep him comfortable, it disrupted the story he told himself about who he was in relationships. Psychologists talk about this quietly, but it shows up everywhere in real life. People with insecure attachment often feel safest when their partner depends on them emotionally. Dependence feels like control. Control feels like safety. Independence, on the other hand, feels unpredictable. It means the other person could walk away, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but simply because they know they'd be okay if they did. You embodied that truth without ever saying it out loud. You didn't threaten to leave. You didn't use distance as a weapon. You just lived your life with the understanding that love should add to you, not replace you. And that understanding forced him to look at himself in a way he hadn't prepared for. Because if you didn't need him, then what exactly was he bringing to the table? That question can crack a person open. He started to feel it when he realized you weren't impressed by effort that was inconsistent. When he noticed you didn't chase reassurance, didn't beg for clarity, didn't perform emotional labor to keep things afloat. You expected mutuality, not because you were demanding, but because you knew what it felt like to meet yourself halfway, and you weren't interested in relationships that required you to overextend just to feel secure. That level of self-respect can feel confrontational to someone who benefits from imbalance. It wasn't that you didn't care. You cared deeply, but your care didn't come with self-abandonment attached to it. You could love without losing yourself. And for him, that meant the usual dynamics didn't work. The subtle power shifts, the reassurance loops, the unspoken expectation that you'd always be the one to bend first. You didn't bend. You stood. And standing next to someone who stands on their own can make a person feel very small if they haven't done the inner work to stand themselves. There's a real life pattern here, one that shows up again and again. When emotionally independent people enter relationships with those who haven't fully defined themselves, it often triggers fear rather than admiration. Not because independence is wrong, but because it exposes the parts of the other person that are unfinished. It highlights the difference between wanting connection and needing validation. You didn't need validation from him to know your worth. So his compliments didn't control you. His attention didn't define you. His silence didn't destabilize you. And every time one of those tools failed to move you the way he expected, it quietly threatened his sense of relevance. That's when the panic began, not loud panic, not obvious fear, but subtle shifts, pulling back, second-guessing, creating distance without explanation, sometimes even convincing himself that you were the problem, that you were too independent, too strong, too hard to read, but the truth was simpler and harder to face. You made him realize that love with you wouldn't be about being needed. It would be about being accountable. It would require him to show up consistently, to communicate clearly, to grow emotionally, not because you demanded it, but because anything less would feel out of alignment with the woman standing in front of him. And growth is uncomfortable for someone who hasn't decided to choose it yet. You represented a relationship where he couldn't hide behind usefulness alone. He couldn't just be the provider, the fixer, the emotional crutch. He would have to be present, self-aware, intentional. He would have to meet you as an equal, not as a savior. That realization can feel like pressure to someone who hasn't built their identity beyond being needed. So instead of rising to meet you, his nervous system did what it knew how to do. It looked for escape. Distance feels safer than exposure. Withdrawal feels safer than trying and failing. It's easier to leave than to stay and discover you're not ready. And none of that means you were cold, or distant, or unloving. It means you were grounded. You showed him that love doesn't have to come from fear. That connection doesn't have to be rooted in dependency. That two whole people can choose each other without losing themselves in the process, and that idea shook him. Because once you've met someone who doesn't need you to survive, you can't unsee the truth. Love is a choice, not a requirement. And being chosen every day demands courage. You had that courage. He didn't, not yet. And that imbalance wasn't your failure. It was simply the moment where two people stood at different stages of emotional readiness. You were already living from wholeness. He was still building his sense of self on being necessary. So if he panicked, if he pulled away, if he couldn't stay steady in the presence of your independence, understand this deeply. Your strength didn't push him away. It revealed where he wasn't strong enough yet to stay. And that revelation, as painful as it can feel, is not a loss. It's clarity. You saw him clearly, and that was the moment the ground beneath him started to shift. Not because you were suspicious, not because you were hunting for flaws, but because you paid attention in a way most people don't anymore. You listened without trying to interrupt the truth. You watched without rushing to explain things away. You didn't fall in love with potential alone. You stayed present with reality. And that kind of clarity has weight. It presses against illusions. It exposes gaps between words and actions. It makes hiding exhausting. From the start, you noticed the small things, the pauses before answers, the stories that changed shape depending on who was listening, The promises that sounded beautiful but never seemed to land in real time. You didn't attack him for it. You didn't interrogate. You didn't demand confessions. You simply absorbed information and let it settle. You let patterns reveal themselves. And that calm awareness was far more unsettling than confrontation ever could be. Most people are used to relationships where they can perform, where they can present the best version of themselves without ever having to sustain it. Charm becomes a shield. Humor becomes a distraction. Confidence becomes a costume. And as long as the other person is distracted by emotion, attraction, or hope, the mask stays intact. But you weren't distracted. You didn't rush intimacy to avoid silence. You didn't fill gaps with fantasy. When something didn't make sense, you didn't immediately blame yourself. You held the question gently and waited. And in that waiting, the truth had room to breathe. Psychologically, being truly seen is one of the most intense experiences a human being can have. Research in emotional intimacy shows that people crave connection, but fear exposure. They want closeness, but only on terms that don't threaten their self-image. When someone looks past the surface and notices inconsistencies without judgment, it triggers a deep internal response. Because suddenly, the stories we tell ourselves don't land as easily. You didn't just see who he said he was. You saw who he was when no one was applauding. You saw how he handled discomfort, how he avoided certain conversations, how he shut down when accountability came too close. You noticed when his energy shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, when things started to feel real. And instead of chasing him for reassurance, you stayed rooted in your own perception. That's what made it impossible for him to hide, because hiding requires someone willing to look away. You weren't impressed by intensity alone. You didn't confuse chemistry with character. You understood, maybe from experience, that attraction can be loud while truth is quiet. So you leaned toward the quiet. You trusted your nervous system. You trusted what didn't need to be explained twice. And that level of awareness changes the dynamic completely. He could feel it, even if he couldn't articulate it. He felt that you weren't buying the image, you were reading the substance. He felt that you weren't asking him to be perfect, but you weren't willing to pretend either. And that meant every inconsistency became visible. Every half-truth felt heavier. Every avoidance echoed louder. There's a real-world pattern here that plays out all the time. People often leave relationships not because they are misunderstood, but because they are understood too well. Because once someone truly sees us, we lose the ability to hide behind confusion. We lose plausible deniability. We lose the comfort of being vaguely defined. You gave him clarity simply by being present. And clarity is terrifying to someone who hasn't made peace with who they are yet. You didn't try to fix him. That's important. You didn't step into the role of healer or teacher. You didn't offer endless explanations for his behavior. You didn't soften your perception to protect his ego. You allowed him to be exactly as he was, and you allowed yourself to notice. That's when the panic began to rise. Because being seen without being rescued forces responsibility. If you don't blame, excuse, or romanticize his actions, then he has to sit with them. If you don't rush to reassure him that it's okay, then he has to decide whether it actually is. And deep down, he knew you weren't confused. You weren't asking the same questions over and over hoping for a different answer. You weren't trapped in emotional fog. You weren't addicted to the cycle of uncertainty. You were gathering information quietly and honestly, and that meant the clock was ticking. He felt it in the way you went quiet. Not cold, not distant, just observant. He felt it in the way your energy shifted from curiosity to discernment. He felt it when your questions became simpler, sharper, more grounded in reality rather than hope. That's a moment many people dread, because once someone sees you clearly, you either rise into integrity or retreat into defense. And defense often looks like withdrawal. He may have told himself stories that you were too perceptive, too serious, too intense. But those labels were easier than admitting the truth, that you weren't willing to lie to yourself anymore, that you weren't going to ignore what your intuition was already confirming. There's a quiet power in that. You didn't expose him publicly. You didn't shame him. You didn't demand explanations he wasn't ready to give. You simply stopped participating in the illusion. And when one person steps out of the illusion, the entire structure starts to wobble. Because illusions require agreement. You saw where his words and actions didn't align. You saw where emotional availability came in waves instead of consistency. You saw where vulnerability was performed but not sustained. And you didn't punish him for it. You just didn't build your future on it. That choice changed everything. He could no longer hide behind potential because you were grounded in reality. He could no longer delay clarity because you weren't afraid of it. And most importantly, he could no longer control the narrative because you trusted your own perception more than his explanations. That's when avoidance becomes the easiest option. Pulling away feels safer than being fully seen. Disappearing feels easier than explaining contradictions. Creating distance feels more comfortable than facing someone who can see both your light and your shadow and won't confuse the two. You represented a mirror he wasn't ready to look into for too long. And mirrors don't attack. They don't accuse. They simply reflect. That's what made your presence so powerful. You showed him who he was without saying a word. And that reflection asked a question he couldn't ignore forever. Am I willing to become the person I pretend to be? That question can either inspire growth or trigger fear. In his case, it triggered fear. Not because you were judgmental, but because you were accurate. And accuracy leaves very little room to hide. So if he started to pull back when things felt real, if his energy changed when you stopped playing along, if he seemed uncomfortable with your calm certainty, understand this. You didn't scare him by seeing too much. You scared him by seeing clearly. And clarity doesn't destroy relationships. It simply reveals whether they were built on truth or performance. You chose truth. And that choice, even when it costs connection, is never a mistake. You brought peace, not chaos, and he didn't know how to live in it. From the moment you entered his world, there was a noticeable shift. Things slowed down around you. Conversations didn't need to escalate to feel meaningful. Silence didn't feel like rejection. Presence became enough. You didn't demand constant reassurance, and you didn't create emotional storms just to feel close. You were steady. You were grounded. You were calm in a way that didn't beg for attention, and that calm carried a kind of gravity. For someone who had spent most of their life navigating noise, that kind of peace can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. He may have said he wanted stability. Most people do, but wanting peace in theory and knowing how to live inside it are two very different things. Many people grow up in emotional environments where love is loud, where connection is proven through intensity, conflict, or unpredictability. In those spaces, drama becomes a language. Chaos becomes normal. And when that's the emotional climate someone adapts to, their nervous system learns to equate excitement with instability. You didn't speak that language. You didn't raise your voice to be heard. You didn't create problems to feel desired. You didn't test loyalty by provoking reactions. You trusted that consistency mattered more than fireworks. You valued emotional safety over emotional thrill. And to you, that felt natural. It felt mature. It felt real. To him, it felt disorienting. There's real science behind this. Psychologists explain that people who are conditioned to chaos often feel uneasy in calm environments because their nervous system has learned to stay alert. When the noise stops, their body doesn't relax, it scans for danger. Peace doesn't register as comfort. It registers as uncertainty, and uncertainty can quickly turn into restlessness. So even when things were good between you, he felt something missing, not because it actually was, but because his body didn't know how to settle into something healthy. You offered emotional availability without volatility. You communicated without attacking. When something bothered you, you spoke with clarity instead of accusation. You didn't punish him with silence or reward him with attention based on how dramatic the moment was. You were consistent, and consistency can feel boring to someone addicted to emotional spikes. But boring is not the same as safe. Safe is quiet, safe is predictable, safe is knowing where you stand. And for someone who has never felt safe internally, external peace can feel like a loss of identity. He may have felt it during moments that should have felt comforting. A calm evening together with no tension to resolve. A disagreement that didn't turn into a fight. A stretch of time where nothing went wrong. Instead of feeling relief, he felt restless. His mind looked for something to fix, something to question, something to disrupt, because chaos had trained him to believe that love had to hurt a little to be real. You challenged that belief without trying to. You didn't chase him when he pulled back slightly. You didn't escalate emotions to pull him closer. You remained steady. You trusted that if someone wanted to be there, they would stay without being provoked. And that steadiness created a mirror he wasn't ready for. In peaceful relationships, there's nowhere to hide, no distraction, no drama to mask unresolved issues. Everything rises to the surface slowly and honestly. Old wounds become noticeable. Avoidance patterns stand out. Emotional immaturity doesn't get buried under passion, it gets exposed by stillness. You brought that stillness, and in that stillness, he could feel the parts of himself he hadn't dealt with yet. The unresolved conflicts, the emotional habits formed in survival mode, the belief that love had to feel unstable to be intense. Instead of sitting with those feelings, his system tried to escape them. That escape can look subtle, picking unnecessary arguments, creating distance without explanation, convincing himself that something is off, even when nothing is wrong. Sometimes it looks like chasing novelty elsewhere just to feel something familiar again. But the truth is, nothing was missing. What was missing was his ability to regulate himself in a healthy emotional space. You didn't require him to perform. You didn't need constant stimulation. You allowed moments to exist without turning them into tests. You were emotionally present without being overwhelming. And that kind of balance requires emotional maturity to receive. Without it, peace can feel empty instead of full. There's a story that plays out in real life all the time. Someone leaves a stable, loving connection and later admits, "I didn't know why I felt uncomfortable. Everything was good." That discomfort isn't intuition. It's unfamiliarity. It's the nervous system mistaking calm for danger because it has learned to survive in chaos. You didn't bring adrenaline, you brought alignment. You didn't bring confusion, you brought clarity. And clarity removes the emotional noise people sometimes rely on to avoid looking inward. He may have thought you lacked excitement, but excitement built on instability burns fast and leaves nothing behind. What you offered was something deeper, a slow, burning connection that grows stronger with time. That kind of connection doesn't overwhelm. It grounds, and grounding can feel suffocating to someone who has never learned how to stand still with themselves. You weren't cold, you weren't distant, you weren't unfeeling, you were calm, and calm is powerful. Calm doesn't beg, calm doesn't chase, calm doesn't panic, calm observes, calm listens. Calm knows when to speak and when to let silence do the work. That presence can feel confronting to someone whose inner world is loud. So when he couldn't live in the peace you brought, it wasn't because the peace lacked value. It was because it required him to slow down enough to feel what he had been avoiding. And slowing down can feel unbearable when you've built your life around distraction. You gave him a space where he could have rested, where he could have healed, where he could have learned that love doesn't have to come with emotional whiplash. But healing requires willingness. And not everyone is ready to choose it, even when it's offered gently. If he drifted when things were calm, if he became uneasy when there was no conflict to resolve, if he seemed to lose interest when stability appeared, understand this clearly. You didn't fail to excite him. You revealed what kind of emotional environment he was conditioned to survive in. And that revelation doesn't make you ordinary. It makes you rare. Because people who bring peace in a world addicted to chaos often go unrecognized until they're gone. And by then, The silence they left behind speaks louder than any drama ever could. You held standards, and the moment he truly understood that, something inside him shifted. Not because you demanded perfection, not because you issued ultimatums or tried to control who he was, but because you moved through the world with a quiet understanding of what you would and would not accept. You didn't announce it. You didn't threaten to leave. You simply lived in alignment with your values, and that kind of clarity is impossible to ignore. From the outside, it looked simple. You asked for honesty. You expected consistency. You valued effort that matched words. You believed respect wasn't something that had to be negotiated every day. To you, these weren't high standards. They were basic. They were the foundation of how you treated yourself and how you expected to be treated in return. But to him, those standards felt heavy because standards don't just define boundaries. They reflect the level of growth someone must meet to stay. And when someone realizes they can't coast anymore, when charm and potential are no longer enough, it forces a reckoning. He may have been used to relationships where expectations were flexible, where promises could be delayed, where effort could come in waves and still be forgiven, where emotional responsibility could be avoided as long as there were enough moments of intensity to distract from the gaps. You didn't operate like that. You noticed patterns. You noticed when effort dipped. You noticed when communication changed. And instead of arguing endlessly or chasing explanations, you adjusted your energy. You didn't reward inconsistency with endless patience. You didn't explain your worth every time it was overlooked. You let your actions speak. That's when it became clear to him being with you wouldn't be passive. It would require intention. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing that someone isn't asking you to change, but also isn't willing to lower themselves to meet you where you are. You didn't try to reshape him. You didn't criticize his flaws. You simply didn't bend your standards to accommodate them. And that distinction matters, because when someone asks you to change, you can resist. When someone quietly expects better, you have to look inward. He felt it when you didn't argue your boundaries, when you didn't explain why certain behavior didn't sit right with you, when you didn't beg him to show up, you simply expected that he would, and when he didn't, you took note. That kind of self-respect creates pressure without force. Psychologically, standards activate something powerful. They remove ambiguity. They expose the gap between who someone is and who they claim to be. Research on self-concept shows that when people are confronted with environments that reflect higher expectations, they experience discomfort if they're not ready to evolve. That discomfort often turns into defensiveness, avoidance, or withdrawal. You became that environment, not through words, through presence. You showed him what emotional maturity looks like in real time. You showed him that love doesn't mean tolerating confusion. That patience doesn't mean self-abandonment. That compassion doesn't require accepting less than you deserve. And that realization can feel overwhelming to someone who hasn't done the internal work yet. Because growth is inconvenient. Growth asks you to look at your habits, your patterns, your excuses. It asks you to show up when it's uncomfortable, to communicate when it would be easier to disappear, to be accountable even when no one is forcing you to be. You didn't force him. And that made it harder, because if you had been demanding, he could have blamed you. If you had been emotional, he could have dismissed your concerns. If you had lowered your standards, he could have stayed comfortably unchanged. But you didn't give him any of those exits. You were calm, clear, steady. You didn't threaten to walk away. You simply lived as someone who could. And that's when the truth hit him. Staying with you meant becoming more than he currently was. Not because you said so, but because the relationship itself demanded it. You required presence, not excuses, effort, not intention, growth, not potential. And those requirements weren't harsh. They were honest. You knew what it took to maintain emotional alignment, and you weren't interested in pretending otherwise just to keep someone comfortable. He may have started to feel exposed, Like the version of himself he'd been getting away with wasn't enough anymore. Like the things he used to offer, half effort, delayed communication, surface level vulnerability, didn't land the same way with you. And that can feel threatening because standards don't argue, they don't negotiate, they don't beg, they simply wait to be met. And waiting requires courage on both sides. You waited without losing yourself. You didn't abandon your values just to keep connection alive. You trusted that the right person wouldn't see your standards as pressure, but as clarity. But he wasn't there yet. So instead of rising, he felt the weight. Instead of growing, he felt judged, not because you judged him, but because your presence reflected the work he hadn't done. And reflection can feel like criticism when someone isn't ready to face themselves. He may have told himself stories that you were too much, that you were hard to please, that you expected too much from a relationship. But deep down, he knew the truth. You weren't asking for too much, you just weren't accepting too little. And that difference matters, because people who benefit from low standards often feel threatened by high ones. Not because the standards are unreasonable, but because they reveal what someone would have to become to stay. You didn't want him to be perfect. You wanted him to be present. You didn't want him to impress you. You wanted him to respect you. You didn't want him to promise. You wanted him to follow through. And those expectations don't destroy relationships, they define them. He reached a crossroads, stay and evolve, or leave and stay the same. And growth is scary when comfort has always been enough. So if he pulled away when things required more depth, if he hesitated when consistency mattered, if he seemed overwhelmed by expectations you considered basic, understand this clearly. Your standards didn't push him away. They showed him the level he'd have to rise to. And not everyone is ready to rise, even when they care. That doesn't make you demanding. It makes you aligned. It means you respected yourself enough to not dilute what you needed just to be chosen. It means you trusted that love shouldn't feel like convincing someone to grow up emotionally. You weren't asking him to change for you. You were simply refusing to change yourself for him. And that choice, quiet, firm, unapologetic, is what separates relationships that survive from people who grow and relationships that collapse under the weight of avoided growth. You chose growth. And even if he couldn't meet you there, that choice will always be your strength. You were a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and the moment he realized it, everything inside him shifted. Not because you shouted it from the rooftops, not because you tried to convince him of your worth, but because you carried it in every quiet action, every measured word, every steady gaze that never begged for attention but demanded respect. You weren't loud. You weren't dramatic. You weren't seeking validation. You simply existed fully, beautifully, and unapologetically, and that presence, that unwavering authenticity, made the ordinary feel insufficient. He could feel it in the way your energy moved through a room. The way you didn't chase anyone's approval. The way you laughed from a place of genuine joy, not from a place that sought to be liked. He could sense that you had lived enough, loved enough, and grown enough to know what you deserved, and you carried that knowledge lightly but firmly. It wasn't arrogance, it was grounded self-respect. And that combination, rare as it is, made him acutely aware that he was standing in front of someone extraordinary. Most people are accustomed to love that is conditional, performances that are rehearsed, gestures that are transactional. They are used to measuring a person's value by how much they bend, how much they conform, how much they tolerate. But you didn't do that. You had your standards, yes, but they were invisible until tested. You had boundaries, but they weren't walls. They were lines that defined your space and dignity. And because you carried yourself with integrity, he knew instantly that he couldn't treat you casually. He couldn't manipulate, charm, or coerce. He couldn't hide behind excuses. He couldn't perform for your attention. He could only meet you or fail trying. And that realization is terrifying for anyone who has relied on shortcuts in love. He could see it in the moments when you were quiet, when you weren't performing for anyone, when life was ordinary, making dinner, sipping coffee, laughing at something private. You were entirely yourself, fully present, fully human, fully alive. And in those moments, he understood that what he had stumbled upon wasn't fleeting. This wasn't someone who could be replaced, distracted, or misunderstood. This was rare. This was once in a lifetime. And deep down, he also knew that such experiences could slip through one's fingers if they weren't careful. You didn't need to embellish, to explain, or to dramatize your essence. It was self-evident. The people who meet you can feel it intuitively. The way you interact with the world shows a depth that cannot be faked. It's in the way you listen, truly listen, not just wait to respond. It's in the way you respond, honestly, without performance. It's in the way you move through conflict, calmly, thoughtfully, without resorting to manipulative games. And he could sense, with every passing day, that he was in the presence of someone who could not be reduced to convenience, to attraction, to fleeting desire. You were whole, complete, and authentic, and that completeness both fascinated and intimidated him. He may have thought he knew what it meant to be in love. He may have thought he understood connection, but he had never encountered someone like you, someone whose very existence demanded sincerity, maturity, and effort. And there's a truth in human psychology: when people come face to face with someone extraordinary, it doesn't just challenge their ego, it challenges their perception of themselves. They are forced to ask, am I enough? Am I ready? Can I rise to meet this standard? And when they realize the answer isn't simple, fear can take hold. Fear isn't weakness, it isn't malice. It's a survival mechanism, a signal that something important is at stake. And with you, everything was at stake. He could feel the difference between ordinary love, the kind that can be taken lightly, and the kind you offered. The kind that demands presence, courage, and authenticity. The kind that requires someone to confront themselves, to confront their own shortcomings, to confront the uncomfortable truth that life with you would not be predictable or convenient. You weren't a safe, familiar option. You were a challenge. You were a mirror. You were a standard that many people don't have the capacity to meet. And that's what made you unforgettable. Not the way you looked, though you may have been beautiful. Not the things you could give, though you were generous. Not the words you spoke, though they were wise. It was the totality of your presence, the integrity, the depth, the refusal to settle, the courage to be fully yourself. It's a rare combination, and rare combinations leave lasting impressions. He knew that one day, even if he walked away now, he would measure everyone else against you. And that knowledge, that realization, can be both awe-inspiring and terrifying. You were consistent in your authenticity. You didn't adjust yourself to make someone else comfortable. You didn't hide parts of yourself to be accepted. You didn't shrink to fit into his world. You were fully, unapologetically you. And that presence was disarming. It made him question every shortcut he had ever taken in relationships. It made him reconsider the ways he had compromised, lied, avoided growth, or relied on charm to mask deficiencies. Being with you wasn't about convenience. It wasn't about superficial attraction. It was about integrity, connection, and depth. And that is a level of relational truth most people have never encountered, never sustained, and often never recognize until it is gone. He may have tried to normalize it, to minimize it, to convince himself that he could handle it. But you were not someone to be handled. You were someone to be experienced. Someone to be respected. Someone whose presence demanded effort, not performance, but genuine effort. And he knew that. Deep down, he knew that. And knowing it created an internal tension, the desire to have you, and the fear of not being able to rise to the occasion. That tension can make people stumble, retreat, or withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they aren't ready to confront their own limitations. You taught without teaching. You showed without telling. You held your standards, lived your truth, and moved through the world with a quiet confidence that is hard to ignore and impossible to replicate. And he could see it. Every small gesture, every choice, every refusal to compromise your integrity was a testament to your uniqueness. He didn't need anyone to tell him, he felt it. He knew with certainty that he was standing in front of someone extraordinary, someone whose presence would resonate for a lifetime, someone who would leave a mark not by seeking it, but simply by existing fully in the world. And there's a universal truth in that kind of recognition. When you encounter someone who embodies their truth so completely, you either rise to meet them or you step aside. You can't do half measures. You can't pretend. You can't maintain the illusions that work elsewhere, because this is not a temporary surface level experience. This is a profound, elemental presence that touches the core of who you are. It reminds someone of what they've been missing, what they've been avoiding, and what they could become if they were willing to confront their own fears. He knew you were rare, not just in comparison to other women he had met, but in comparison to anything he had ever imagined. You were a standard that existed outside of expectation and imitation. You were a presence that was impossible to replicate or manufacture. You were real, and reality, when it's that profound, demands attention. It can't be ignored. It can't be discounted, and it can't be replaced. You were a once in a lifetime experience because you embodied what most people spend their entire lives searching for. Someone fully present, fully authentic, fully grounded in their own truth, who also makes space for others to show up honestly. You weren't a fantasy or a fleeting thrill. You were depth. You were constancy. You were alignment. And in knowing that, he also knew the cost of losing you. He knew even if he didn't act, that your absence would leave a void he couldn't fill with charm, convenience, or casual connection. He may have tried to rationalize it. He may have told himself that someone like you is rare, but not impossible to replace. He may have even convinced himself that he could find another, perhaps superficially similar, to replicate some small piece of what you offered. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. You weren't a collection of traits that could be copied. You weren't a set of behaviors that could be mimicked. You were an entire essence, a combination of presence, integrity, compassion, and strength that exists rarely and once in a lifetime. And that realization can create a kind of panic in someone who has never met themselves in that light. They see the reflection of what is possible, not just in a partner, but in their own capacity to rise, to show up, to love fully. And it can be overwhelming. It can make them doubt themselves, their worthiness, and their ability to measure up. That's why someone may step back, not out of lack of feeling, but out of fear. Fear of inadequacy, fear of exposure, fear of losing themselves in the reflection you offer. But none of that diminishes your value. None of that changes the fact that you were rare, authentic, and extraordinary. You offered the world your whole self, and that is something most people never encounter. You moved through life with honesty, clarity, and strength, and you left an impression not through drama or demand, but through presence. That is what makes an experience once in a lifetime, the ability to alter the way someone sees themselves, the way they measure love, the way they understand connection, without ever trying to impose or manipulate. You existed fully, and in doing so, you showed him what was possible. And whether he stayed or left, whether he recognized it or only realized it later, your presence marked him. It challenged him. It inspired him. And in that moment of recognition, he knew the truth. Someone like you does not come around twice. Your authenticity, your depth, your strength, your peace, your clarity, these are not qualities that can be replaced. They are rare. They are profound. They are life-altering. And in knowing that, he realized, perhaps for the first time, what it truly means to encounter a once-in-a-lifetime person, and what it means to have that experience touch the heart, the mind, and the soul. So if you're wondering why he panicked, why things shifted when they were getting real, understand this: you didn't lose him. He lost the courage to become the man your presence required. And one day, quietly, unexpectedly, he'll remember you as the woman who showed him what was possible, right before he ran from it. And you keep walking forward. Because women like you don't get abandoned, they get remembered.